Good evening. This is Robert Sungenis coming to you on the Robert Sungenis Live program. Ask Your Question for February the 18th, 2020. As you know, this program is set aside for you to ask your questions, give your comments, discuss anything that is of concern to you from a spiritual nature, the church, the Bible, the sacraments, heaven, hell, purgatory, indulgences, anything of a religious nature in Catholicism. And as my role as host of this program, I will endeavor to relate your call to our Catholic faith and provide for you the truth, the answer that's given by Catholic tradition, the fathers, the medievals, the popes, the councils, the saints, the doctors, and all that has been made into dogma in the Catholic Church. And we have now, I think we started this program in August. Now, we haven't been on Holy Faith Media for all that time. I think we've been on Holy Faith Media for probably, maybe 2 months now, or maybe longer, a little bit longer. But we started in August on my own Facebook page, and then we transferred over to Holy Faith Media. So all the programs are now on Holy Faith Media. And we do this twice a week on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, beginning at 8 p.m. And usually go to about 10 p.m., depending on how many questions there are. It was slated from 8 to 9, given an hour, but we've had so many questions come in that we've had to stretch it now to 2 hours. So I'm just going to say from 8 to 10 from now on. Unless there's no questions, and then my night will be short and we will end early, and I'll go rest my head on the couch. At any rate, so Tuesdays and Wednesdays, so tomorrow as well, 8 to 10. And you can ask your science questions as well. Before we had let the science questions be asked on our Thursday program, that was 3 times a week we were doing this, and that was a little too much for me. And so we confined it now to 2 programs, and both 8 to 10. So actually, I'm doing it more hours now, having 2 programs, than I was having 3 programs, doing an hour apiece on each program. But such is life. And at any rate, here to answer your questions. So let me see what is available tonight. And okay. All right, so Andrew says, good evening. Good evening to you, Andrew. JB Cool. Cool spelled C-O-O-L, just like the regular cool. Not J-B-K-O-O-L. Okay. This guy is the original OG, whatever that means. What is the translation of the Latin phrase quiscumque? Gosh, what is that? What with this, or what with that, or something like that? Somebody who knows Latin better than I do could probably answer that. What with that? Something along those lines. What are you asking that for, Suzanne? Is there something on your mind? Where do you find that Latin phrase? Perhaps if we can zero in on it, we can figure out, why you're asking it and what it relates to help you even more. So why don't you do that for us? All right. So my friend Svetoslav, I think, if I remember his name correctly, is writing, "Good evening. You will stream in this channel for the future." Yes, we will be on this channel until further notice. So I have everything's been going great, so we have no reason to change. As I said at the beginning of the program, we used to be on my own Facebook page, but now we are on Holy Faith Media. So yeah, been working out well. Okay, Sarah asked, this may be a stupid question. However, some bishops have suggested we may be in the end times. Do you think this is possible? What part of the prophecy of Our Lady of La Salette are we in? Well, that's that's always an intriguing question. I'm sure it gets asked every generation. We're not the first, because a lot of the things that we are going through have been gone through before in various centuries of the church. The church has been up and down in 20 centuries. She's had very good times, and then she's had very bad times. And whatever the times that we've been in, we've been able to come through it. And here we are today, 2,000 years later. But of course, today, I think the question is being asked a lot more than it was in previous times. I think that's a fact. So the question would be then, why is that? Why are people thinking that we're in the end times? Well, I could write you a list as long as my arm, probably both arms, as to why that is the case today. I'm not going to go through each thing, but even was it Pope John, Paul II said, that we're heading into times that are unlike any other time in the church's history, and the devil is attacking the church unlike he has ever done before, and blah, 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 blah. Pope Paul VI said the smoke of Satan has entered through a crack in the church. Things like, I think Benedict himself, when he was Pope, Benedict XVI, said things along those lines. We've had a number of theologians. Usually these are more conservative theologians. The liberal theologians, most of them don't even believe there's an end of time in the sense that you and I do. They don't believe there's going to be a second coming of Christ. They don't believe there's going to be a resurrection of the dead. All kinds of weird ideas. And this is probably one of the reasons why a lot of conservative Catholics believe that we're nearing the end, because we have the majority of Catholicism is liberal today. And those people just don't believe the same things traditionally that we believed about heaven, hell, the last four things. Boy, that's the gospel. And if you don't have that in your teaching, if you don't believe those things anymore, then we really don't believe in Christianity. Okay. So there's a lot of false Christianity out there, wherein these very liberal theologians just try to basically talk their way out of all the doctrines that we had believed in tradition. Okay. So there's another reason, why a lot of people think so. Then we have, like you mentioned, we've had La Salette, we've had Fatima, we've had Quito, Ecuador, and we've had more Marian apparitions in the 20th century, probably than all the other centuries combined. Okay, so, there's another reason, and each message is very similar, at least the ones that have been approved. They have been very similar. And they say the same thing. There will be a disruption in the church unlike we've ever seen. There will be doctrines that will be rejected like we've never seen. And that's what we're seeing today by leaps and bounds. Okay. We've seen in different avenues of academics and the sciences, we've seen them reach a point now, whether it's physics, chemistry, quantum mechanics, astronomy, mathematics, where they have like reached the end of their rope, so to speak, where they have accumulated so much data that they really don't now understand it. They really don't know how to connect the dots, as we say, and make sense of it all. The more knowledge they get, the more confused they get. Now, although we have reached plateaus where we can invent the cell phone and the computer and all those things, but they're pretty simple actually when you stand back and look at them and you see how they're really working. Once we came into the digital age, all the mystery was taken out of it. It's just a lot of zeros and ones all combined very fast. And, that's why everything works so well and so fast for us, because somebody just simplified it down to zeros and ones and put them all together. And depending on what machine you put them in, it's going to act accordingly. Okay. But I'm talking about the whole understanding of the cosmos and humankind, like even psychology. We've been through how many phases of psychology, psychiatry, and how the mind of man works. And they've reached an end of their rope. They can't explain anything. It's just a mystery to them, basically. They know certain things, but nobody's really been able to put it all together. And especially, in my work in science and physics and dealing with the whole what goes around what thing, can you believe it or not? That's coming up to the fore again. We thought we had conquered that, 400 years ago with Galileo and Copernicus. And all of a sudden we find out, well, maybe they just got the whole thing backwards because, we've assumed all this data and, we can't make sense out of it. It could be this or that or the other thing. And we have, quantum mechanics where it's saying that electrons and protons speak to each other from long distances and perform the same tasks without even knowing. We don't even know how they would communicate with one another. That's spooky. Okay. So in other words, we're just reaching a point in society where everything's coming to a head and, something's going to give somewhere someday. And same thing with religion, Christianity. It just seems like everything's coming to a head. The world itself is 7 point something billion people. Okay, how many more it can sustain? Who knows? But we're reaching that limit where we're, all the nations have received the gospel, as Jesus said in Matthew 23:14. This gospel we preach into all the world, and then the end shall come. Well, we pretty much reached that point. Okay, it's basically where we, just a century ago, we would not be able to communicate with somebody in Australia or Africa or whatever. And now you can communicate with them with 2 keystrokes. And so that's all changed. So, that's what I mean when it's coming to a head and there's no more room basically to advance mankind, so to speak, because they've come to this point of no return. And then we see the gospel being preached to all the world. Well, that's another sign. Okay. And by the way, it's got to end sometime. It's not going to go on and on forever and ever. So obviously, we're waiting for that day. And of course, we're nearer that day than any other time before us. So we would be asking these questions with a lot more frequency than the people before us, although they did as well. But as I said, someday it's got to end. All right. And you had 2,000 years for the Old Testament, from say Abraham to Jesus, Okay. It's a little bit more than 2,000. You had another two or 3,000 before the time of Abraham. And so it's adding up. You have 3,000 before Abraham, 2,000, and then we have our 2,000. That's like 7,000 years. Okay. That sounds like a reasonable time where things would come to the end and it would all be over. Because we haven't been here for millions of years. That is total malarkey. And so we can't base how long we're going to live into the future, based on how many years we were here before that. Because if that were the case, then we'd go on for another million years, until the end. That's not going to happen. Okay. If we go by biblical time, we got about 6,000 or 7,000 years at the most, and anything plus or minus that, we don't know. Okay, we have no idea what the exact day is. We never will. Even the Son of Man, as Jesus says, doesn't know that time and season that God has exclusively given to himself. But we know it's coming, and it's by all the signs that we look at, and there's many more signs that I could give, that we are possibly very close to that time. Okay. And so all the more reason do we have to do what's right, continue in our Christian faith, and convince others that there's no hope outside Christianity. This is it. And someday we're all going to stand before God's judgment seat. Okay. That is the truth. That is the gospel. And it's going to happen sooner than later, I believe. Okay. So, all right, let's see what else we have here. All right. So, Sarah, that was not a stupid question. Okay. Just to comfort you. It's probably one of the most important questions that we have today. And now, as a matter of fact, I did a study on, in my commentaries, I've done, the last book I did was Philippians, Colossians, and Thessalonians. And Thessalonians, if you know, in chapter 2 especially, 2 Thessalonians deals with the end of time and the coming of the man of sin, or the man of lawlessness, some people call the Antichrist. Okay. And I describe in that commentary what we are to look for with the coming of the Antichrist. And there are specific things that Paul lays out. As a matter of fact, in his church in Thessalonica, now that was written about 51 AD, they had some of the same problem, so the same questions you're having and a lot of other people have today. There was a rumor going around the church that supposedly came from Paul, but it didn't, because Paul said, no, I didn't write anything like that. But the rumor said that either Jesus had already come and we're to go look for him, or he was going to come like next week, next month, very soon, in other words. Okay. And so this was a rumor going around the whole Thessalonica church, and Paul had to put a stop to it. And the way he put a stop to it was important for them, because, some of these people were, there's a theme running through those epistles of some people, stopping work, quitting their jobs, going into the mountainside, so to speak, to wait for Jesus. And the church was being disrupted by it, because you had all these people not working. And, the church cannot live without its members working and supporting the church. Okay, so this would have become a big problem unless Paul stepped in and wrote these letters to them. And it's the major reason why Paul wrote these letters to them. And he told them, that Jesus is not going to come back unless something happens first. And that thing that's going to happen is the the loosening of Satan, the arrival of the man of sin that is going to possess, Satan is going to possess this man, and he's going to deceive the whole world with signs and wonders, miracles, and he's going to present himself as an emissary, the true emissary of God, God incarnate in the same way Jesus, or similar to what Jesus did when he came on earth. He said, I'm God incarnate. I am God, but I'm also man. Well, that's what the devil is going to do, basically, with this man of sin. He's going to claim that he is God incarnate, and everybody is to follow him, and he'll prove it by this miracles that he's going to do, the same thing Jesus did. He proved his witness of being the Son of God by doing miracles. Well, isn't it apropos that the Antichrist, the false Christ, is going to basically make the same claims, you see? So that's something that we need to look for. And we haven't seen that yet, okay? There's no man on the face of the earth at this point in time that is fulfilling all those qualities that St. Paul talked about in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. Okay. And we know, as Christians, we will know, St. Paul says, when that time is, because it says he will be revealed. And that's the same word, revealed, apocalypsos, that Paul uses of Jesus Christ being revealed when he came, you see. So we will know who he is as Christians. The rest of the world's going to be deceived. Okay. And they're going to follow him like bugs cling to a light at night, and they're not going to be able to get away because they're going to be so deceived by his claims and his miracles that there will be no escape for them. And God will see to it that there's no escape, because in the same chapter, Paul tells us that God is behind it all, and that he is going to allow this deception from the man of sin to influence them. And the words he uses there are words that mean he will continually give them deception, so that they might miss one or two, but they're going to be barraged by deception, and the whole world's going to be involved. So there's going to be societal, political pressure, cultural pressure put on them that it will be impossible to escape unless you're a Christian. Okay. And it will be so bad, the deception will be so bad, that Jesus said in Matthew 24, if the days are not shortened, then even the elect could not be saved. Okay. If possible, even the elect would not be saved. Okay. So that tells you the intensity of it. That we haven't seen. We're coming close to it. Okay. And we would expect that the stage is going to be set for when the man of sin arrives. It's not going to be like night and day, so to speak, where it was all good before he came, and then when he comes, it's all going to be bad. No, there's going to be a progression, so that, it's, like a curve going up, and it reaches its maximum point. Okay. Then he's going to come right there. And so in this time that we're living, as far as I can see, and I've been at this for 45 years or so, as far as I can see, and with the rest of the Bible, how it describes it, it will be an increasing deception, and then we'll have the ultimate final deception. Okay. And that will go on, as John says in the Apocalypse, for his little season. And we don't know how long that is. Okay. I have my ideas how long it is, and I write that in my Apocalypse book, by comparing other times that something similar happened, and how God used the numbers. Okay, the numbers in the Bible are very important. If you've read the Bible, you see numbers all over the place. Well, there's a lot of significance to those numbers symbolically, especially in the prophecies. Okay, So we can have general idea of when it's going to come and how long it's going to last, but that's about it. Okay. But that's another thing we need to look for. So to do to the Thessalonians what Paul, to do, for me to do to you what Paul did to the Thessalonians, I would say, we're not here yet, and we're not going to be here until that man of sin is revealed. And we will know who he is. It won't be any more secret. And that's another thing that Paul says. He will not work in secret. He will be out in the open. Because his job now is to deceive everyone. See, a lot of the evil prior to the end is going to be secret. You know, you got secret societies, and you have men working undercover and all this stuff. Well, not this guy. This guy is going to be open, like he is God himself coming down and saying, you know, and basically what he's going to do is he's going to say, everyone that went before me that was godly, or you lived in a godly society, or you had these great men who did great things, I'm going to basically supersede all of them. And I'm going to be unlike any of them before me. So I am the ultimate. If you're looking for God, look at me. That's it. That's what he's going to say. Okay. So again, totally out in the open. No secrets. Okay. Everything open and above board. And you figure, yeah, that's exactly how it would work. Because if he was secretive and he had to work undercover, so to speak, then we know something was wrong. That, you know, this isn't the way God works. You know, God works out in the open. He's not ashamed of the truth. He just comes right out in the open and preaches the gospel, like at Pentecost, for example. You know, there the apostles are in Jerusalem for the first time in history, preaching the new covenant gospel. Okay, wide open for all the critics to see. And they had their critics. There were Jews from 15 different nations there. You know, and Paul had to preach, or Peter had to preach precisely to them and say, you know what, you're one of the reasons why we had to do all this, because you killed all the prophets in the Old Testament, and he went through all the things that they did, and they caused Jesus to come. So you're the reason why we're here. And you know, so and they came after him, and they stoned Stephen in Acts chapter 7, and the apostles had a hard time going from city to city, and Jesus had warned them, you know, shake the dust off your feet. If they don't listen to you, go to the next city, blah, blah, and keep going. And, you know, so all out in the open, nothing hidden. Okay. That's how God works. So we would expect this Antichrist to do the same thing. He's going to mimic Jesus and God, the Holy Spirit, right down the line. And, you know, make it appear as if, hey, I got nothing to hide. Here it is. And what's going to back him up are all the miracles that he's going to do. You know, you've heard of magicians like David Copperfield and, you know, Houdini and all. Hey, they're nothing compared to what this guy is going to do. Okay, nothing. They're just illusionists. This guy is going to use the preternatural to the max to deceive people. Okay, where it's not an illusion, he's actually changing things. Okay, so that's the kind of environment that we're going to have, and we don't see that yet. Okay, and when we do see it, God help us. But if you're Christian and you've already given your life to God, thank God, because you will be able to see right through it. Okay, and especially even now that I'm giving you this teaching of what's in that chapter, what Paul told the Thessalonians, okay, now you know. Okay, so I would advise you, was it Sarah? Pick up my commentary on robertsongenis.org or .com, Philippians, Colossians, and Thessalonians. Okay, and read very heavily those sections on 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Okay, and that will give you an idea of what's coming in the future, what to look for. But until then, don't be concerned about it. Okay, all right. Okay, so how Christ was the firstborn from the dead, since he himself resurrected people before his resurrection. Also, Moses and Elijah were resurrected as well before Christ. Well, because this is, by the way, this is in my commentary that I just mentioned. Okay, Philippians, Colossians, and Thessalonians, because where this is found is in Colossians chapter 1, okay, verses 10, 11, 12, 13, right around there, okay. Firstborn in Greek does not mean chronological. It can mean in the sense of chronology, okay, but it also is in the sense of rank, okay. So this Greek word is used in either sense. It depends on the context that you're in. Prototokos. Prototokos. Depends on which context you're in as to what the meaning is going to be. Okay, so these passages here, and you can prove that by looking it up. You know, it's used about a dozen times in the Greek New Testament, and you'll see that it's used in two different ways. Okay, so people usually get, confused about that because it just seems so chronological. Firstborn, like Isaac was the firstborn of. Actually, he wasn't, because there was Ishmael. So there's another instance where firstborn in the sense of rank. He was the ranking birth, so to speak, over Ishmael. And that's why, Hagar and Ishmael were kicked out, and because Isaac was the promised seed. And so in that sense, he's the firstborn. Okay. So that's what it means. It means the rank of his resurrection. Christ's resurrection ranks above everybody's, because if he didn't have the highest rank, nobody else could be raised from the dead. Okay, including Elijah and Moses. All right. So in other words, they weren't raised. They were taken into heaven before they died. Okay. But any other person that was raised from the dead, like Lazarus, for example, or the people from Matthew 27:51, is it? They were raised from the dead. Jairus' daughter was raised from the dead. A few people in the Old Testament were raised from the dead. Peter raised somebody from the dead. They couldn't have happened unless Christ was the firstborn in rank. Okay. And all their resurrections, or even their translations, because we don't say Elijah was resurrected, we say he was translated into heaven. All that is possible because of the work of Christ. Okay? All right. Andrew says, which of the ancients, church fathers or philosophers, do you select as far as your main source? I don't. We have the usual suspects, so to speak, of the prominent fathers that we usually look to, like Augustine. You can't avoid Augustine. The whole church is Augustinian in the Catholic Church. Okay. Except for a few instances, whatever Augustine said is what the church did. As a matter of fact, some pope came along later. Who was that? Was it Pius V? I think it was Pius V, who said, because everybody would say to him, well, Augustine says, Pius V had to make some decree and said, look, not everything Augustine said is how the church is run or what we believe is doctrine. Okay. And so you can't say to the Pope, well, Augustine says, in order to try to trump the Pope. If the Pope is laying down a decree, so the church was so Augustinian that a pope had to come along and sort of put margins around him and, warn the people that, just because Augustine said it doesn't mean it's true. Now, a lot of times, of course, Augustine, what he said was true. All right. And there were a lot of these things he said were true. So he's one of our most prominent fathers. Okay. Now, in the second millennium, of course, the guy that filled Augustine's shoes would be Aquinas. All right. Not so many people can come up to Aquinas's level. You had a few that, we would say, were comparable in this, Bonaventure, St. Albert the Great, blah, blah. But he was at the top. Okay. And the unfortunate thing, however, is that, Augustine was more of a Platonist and Aquinas was more Aristotelian. And we can't fault Augustine because hardly anybody even knew Aristotle existed in the first millennium. We didn't know that until they brought up his works from, Egypt? From the libraries around the Middle East. Aristotle's works were suddenly in Europe, in the second millennium. And, Aquinas looked at them and saw they were pretty good and, made the Catholic Church sort of a modified Aristotelian understanding of the world in the 1200s. Then we hadn't had that before in the whole first millennium. It was all mostly Platonic or Neoplatonic. And so, we have two very different ways from the first millennium to the second millennium of how to understand theology. But even then, Aquinas would always go back to Augustine and say, well, Augustine said this, that, the other thing, and I think he's right or almost right, and I'm going to add my little twist to it, and he would do that. So, there was a lot of consistency between the two, even though they had very different ways of viewing the world. When it came to doctrine, everything became, that's where they coalesced. When it came to dealing with philosophical topics, they could diverge a lot, Augustine and Aquinas. Because our Aristotelianism deals basically with particulars, and Platonism deals basically with universals. And it's very hard to join those two together, except just by saying that they should be joined together. But that was all in the philosophical areas. In the biblical areas, these guys were pretty much on the same level, So, and you got in the first millennium, you have Chrysostom from the East, very good father. Probably wrote the second most. The one that wrote the most was Augustine. Second was probably Chrysostom. Okay. And then the East had Basil the Great. He was way up there. One of the most faithful fathers I've ever read. I mean, you just got everything right, including the cosmos and understanding Genesis 1, as opposed to Augustine. Augustine flubbed up on Genesis 1 in many ways. His penchant to have 2 or 3 or 4 interpretations of a passage sometimes became very confusing because it's like, okay, which one did you settle on? And Augustine had this sort of, flow of knowledge, so to speak, where towards the end of his career, he said some things that were very different than his earlier career. Okay, so you have to look at Augustine in the whole, because you can't pick out one thing or the other because, well, he may have said something different down the road. Okay, so that happens a lot with him. Basil, not so much. And then you had Gregory Nazianzus, Very Gregory of Nyssa, very good as well. And those are your Eastern fathers. Your Latin fathers, of course, Ambrose was a great father. Jerome, another great father. And it amazes me a lot of times in reading their writings is how close they are. Athanasius was another good father too. Reading their writings, and they didn't communicate like you and I do. Where you pick up the phone or you go through email or whatever, and we share ideas. These guys, the best they had was horses. If they wanted to send a note to the Pope or another father or whatever to discuss things, they had horses or they had a council. And that's it. So, there wasn't a whole lot of communication between them. And yet they were all writing basically the same things and believing the same things. And it's just a wonder. And that's why the church looked at all these fathers separated in different lands over many miles. And the only time they communicated together was in a council, unless they wanted to communicate by horse. And the church was just amazed at how well they all came to the same conclusions about the Christian religion. And so that's one of the reasons why the church basically said that at the Council of Trent, that when the fathers are in consensus, we hold that as Catholic doctrine. And we are required to believe that as Catholic doctrine. Okay. So, yeah. And that's what we have over all the Protestants and the other religions of the world, that we have a pedigree that goes right back to the beginning, from Jesus and the apostles right back to the fathers. As a matter of fact, some of the fathers knew the apostles. Okay, the Apostle John knew Papias, and he knew Justin Martyr, and Justin Martyr knew Irenaeus, and so we have this complete line of communication that is very important when you're looking at doctrine and what's true and what's not true. Okay, so those are some of the fathers that we look at when we're doing an analysis, and each of them has their strengths, each of them has their weaknesses, and we take that into account when we look at their writings, you see. But when they're in consensus, then all hands are off. We believe what they say, okay? Because that's what the church has commanded. All right. So, Rockstar says, did you find the answer to why God forbid two types of cloth? I forgot to do that. So, let me write that down again. You know what happened is I cleaned my desk the other day because I got a new computer and I had to clean it for the guy that was coming over. And the piece of paper that I wrote this question on went somewhere, and I don't know where. So let me try that one again. Maybe I'll have the answer for you tomorrow. All right, in Leviticus. Okay, let's see what else we got here. Svetoslav. I know you take end time passages very symbolic and at the same time take very literal others such as Genesis and geocentric verses. How do you decide which passage is literal and which is symbolic? Very good question. Very good. You're always thinking, Svetoslav. I like how your mind works. Here's why. Okay. The passages that we take symbolically are when the Bible tells us to take it symbolically, okay, as in a parable, okay? And there's also a thing called a paroimia, very similar to a parable, just a little different. And that's like a chapter like that is John chapter 10, and it's talking about the Good Shepherd. That's a paroimia as opposed to a parable. Okay. So that's one instance where the Bible tells us point blank, take it symbolically. Okay. The other times that we take it symbolically is when we're dealing with prophecy. Okay. That's usually the telltale sign that this is symbolic. Why? Well, because we got a lot of symbolic language that we can't look at literally. Okay. Like the apocalypse. Okay. Now, there are some passages in the apocalypse we take literally, like in the first 3 chapters. Most of that is literal language because we're talking about literal churches that were established in Asia Minor, 7 of them, and these were all real churches. Okay. But even then, when he's dealing with each of the churches, he sometimes talks in symbolic language. Okay. And right away in the, was it verse 7 of chapter 1, he talks about the 7 spirits of God. Well, that's symbolic because we know God doesn't have 7 spirits. Okay. The number 7 is all over the apocalypse, used as a symbolic number. And I think it's used the most in the apocalypse of any other number. And I think it's used 49 times, which is 7 times 7, by the way, just in case you want to delve a little deeper into that. At any rate, this is when we have symbolic language with prophecy. Now, you can go to a passage. Now, sometimes what the Bible will do is it will combine an historical narrative with prophecy. And so you will get language that is historical in nature and prophetic in nature. Okay. Let's say like Hosea chapter 1 and 2. Hosea is told to go marry a whore. And let me explain that so nobody misunderstands the Bible here. Israel at this time in her history is a whore. She's spiritually adulterous. She's going after other gods, and God wastes no time in describing her as a whore. And he calls her his wife, and his wife's become a whore. And in order to give the full effect, and a lot of times we find God doing this. You want to know how I feel? Well, let me show you. So he goes and tells Hosea, you go marry a whore and you live with her. See how it is. Okay. So Hosea is getting this feeling about, wow, God's pretty serious here. And now I know why he's serious, because I live with this whorish woman. Okay. So, and then he lives with this whore, and then he has 3 children. And he says, call this one this name because Israel has apostatized. Call this one this name because she did something else. And call this one this name. And that's like a prophetic name that things are going to get better in the future. And it's talking about when Christ comes. And then Paul goes on and quotes from Hosea 1 in Romans chapter 9 as the fulfillment of this real historical event, the 3rd child of Hosea, as a prophecy of what's going to happen when Jesus comes. You see, so you get that kind of thing in the Bible, where a combination of history and prophecy. You would probably say the same thing, and the fathers taught this. Okay, so I'm not making this up. This is where I got it from. You would have like a passage like Matthew 24, where you have Jesus on the one hand speaking as if, not as if, but the historical situation where he says, this gospel will be preached into all the world, and the end shall come. You will see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, as Daniel said, and Daniel's was all prophecy. Daniel's books, most of them are prophecy. And he says this is fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy. And then he goes on, you will see false Christs and false miracles, and pray that your flight is not on the Sabbath. So the Sabbath was practiced in the first century. We don't practice the Sabbath now, at least not literally. Hopefully your flight is not in winter, and your wife is not pregnant. All this kind of very intricate, detailed historical stuff that would happen in his day. Okay. And then you get this transition, and it may not even be a transition, maybe it's just a double meaning, where he says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, and in verse 29, he says, you will see the Son of Man coming as lightning shining from east to west, and the dead shall be raised, and the voice of the trumpet shall sound, and he will gather his elect from the four quarters of the earth. And, this is end times language, okay? And that's right after Jesus is talking about this historical situation about not having to flee from all this false stuff on the Sabbath day, okay? So what the fathers did with this is they said, okay, so we have an historical situation that has language in it that can also be that is prophetic, and then at the tail end of that, it becomes all prophetic. Okay, so it's sort of interweaving throughout Matthew 24, and then we come to the end, and it just we get this total prophetic scene. And he talks about, verse 36, that day or hour no man knows, not even the Son nor the angels. It shall be like the days of Noah. They were all called into the ark, and then the flood came suddenly. Then he gives another few parables about the end of the world. Okay, so we know that this is the end of the world. He talks about the seeing the fig tree, but it's only in leaf; it's not bearing fruit. Very possible allusion to the nation of Israel. Okay, we see a nation, we see the tree, but we don't see any fruit, because that's what it's going to be like at the end of time. And how long has Israel as a nation been in existence? Since 1948. Have we seen any fruit? A trickle. Okay. Same thing that was true in Jesus' day. He had a trickle. Okay. So there's another thing that's prophetic. Okay. So in other words, sometimes the Bible will mix history with prophecy, but the major sign of symbolism is prophecy. Whenever we see that in the Bible, we know we've got symbolism. True in Daniel, chapters 2, 7, 8, 9, 11, and 12. Zechariah, same thing. Zechariah, almost all of Zechariah, but especially 11, 12, 13, and 14. Okay. Zechariah is quoted a few times in the Gospels, referring right to the crucifixion. But you'll look at Zechariah's language, and it's all symbolic. Okay. Ezekiel 40 to 48, it's all symbolic language. You'll find the two sticks, Ezekiel 36, all symbolic language and referring to the New Testament. Now, sometimes you'll get like Isaiah 7 and 8, where it talks about Emmanuel. We sing our Christmas songs about Emmanuel, comes from Isaiah 7:14. Okay. But then in chapter 8, there seems to be an historical fulfillment of this sort of savior that was talked about in Isaiah 7. Meller Hashbashaz, I think his name is, probably murdering that name now, but right in the beginning of chapter 8, right after chapter 7, So you have this, again, you have this historical fulfillment, but you also have this prophetic fulfillment, and that won't come, of course, until Jesus comes, which is what, 700 years later or more, after this prophecy of him is given in Isaiah 7:14. Okay, so I don't know how much more I could say about it. I'm trying to think of other passages that would be a giveaway. But if there's no prophetic element, then you won't find any symbolic language. You may find a few verses or so because they will use metaphors and personification, similes, all that figures of speech they will use to describe a certain situation in an historical narrative of the Old Testament, but it won't be prophetic, as we know prophecy. Okay, so, but that's the reason why. Genesis, on the other hand, 1, 2, 3, the only thing prophetic about Genesis in those chapters is Genesis 3:15, where it talks about, the woman crushing the serpent's head, and, the Satan will come after her children, and, and all that kind of stuff. That's prophetic. In the ultimate sense. In the historical sense, this, we were trying to crush Satan's head, with all the patriarchs, Abraham, Noah. In that sense, they were crushing his head, so to speak. But that ultimate fulfillment of that verse would not come until Christ came. Okay, so, but all the rest of Genesis, there's not a symbolic word in it. Okay, not one in Genesis, from Genesis 1 to 11. So that's why we take it literally. And we have clues in Genesis 1 to 11 of why we should take it literally. Because if you look at, say, the flood, for example, that's from chapter 6 through chapter 9. And what do we have there? What kind of writing do we have there? Well, we have writing that you could model after the New York Times or the Washington Post. It's written just like a newspaper article. And newspaper articles don't delve into prophecy or figures of speech or whatever. Their language is exact. And that's their job, to make their language as exact and precise as they possibly can, so everybody gets what actually happened that they're reporting on. And that there's no room for anybody to say, well, this is symbolic or ambiguous or whatever. No, they have to make sure that it's exactly right. Or a court reporter, there's no symbolism there, no metaphors there, because they have to say it exactly what happened. Okay, and that's the way Genesis 6 to 9 is written, like a court reporter. This happened this time. This happened, 7 days later. And 7 days later, this happened, and blah, blah, blah. So we know we're reading an historical narrative of an actual event. And there's nothing symbolic about it at all. Okay. Same thing when we read the genealogies, Genesis 5 and 11. It's written just like a newspaper would. Joe Smith lived this long and had John Smith as his son, and John lived this long and had Mary Smith is the daughter, and, well, they actually didn't name females in there, so we'll just stick with males. It named Jimmy Smith after John Smith, and we know how long that happened because it gives us the exact time. Okay, so that's all literal. Okay, no symbolism there, no prophecy there. So you take the other stories, like Genesis 1, it says, this happened and on the first day, and it concludes it by saying, and there was evening and morning the first day. Okay, sounds pretty literal. Okay, and then the second day it says he made the firmament, and at the end of that it says, and there was evening and morning the second day. Okay, it sounds like an historical record, doesn't it? I mean, if you were a court reporter, that's the way you would do it. Here's what they did the first day, the second day, third day makes the plants, and there was evening and morning the third day. Okay. Next, he makes the sun, moon, and stars, and there was evening and morning the fourth day. Okay. So on and so on through to the sixth day. So we have a pretty literal thing there going on. Now, some people try to find confusion between Genesis 1 and 2 by saying, well, you know, it says that the garden was there before Adam was created, and then it says the garden was there after Adam was created, and all this stuff. There's no confusion there at all if you look at the Hebrew words and figure out what they're referring to, because you have a whole set of words used in Hebrew in Genesis 1 that you don't have used in Genesis 2. Because why? Because it's giving you a different angle to look at, okay? Especially with the trees and the shrubs and all this, they try to find some kind of confusion there, or contradiction is what they're really looking for. But there is no contradiction there. And you can read all about that in my Genesis commentary that you can get at robertsongenesis.org. I show you how to view these two chapters and make them all historical events. Okay. And, you know, so there, that's as much as I can give you on why we do what we do when we look at the Bible and interpret either literally or symbolically. Okay. All right. Okay. So Rockstar says you're streaming from your Robertson Genesis channel, not only Faith Media, Holy Faith Media. Yeah, that was added, Jonathan? 2 weeks ago. We added my own Facebook page and whatever. I don't know what Jonathan knows where we're going. I'm just here to answer questions. So, but yes, that is true. Okay, so another person, Thessalonians. How do you guys come up with these pseudonyms? I just don't know. Anyway, it says, hey, Robert, I'm a prot, and I love your work on justification contra Horton. I find that your position about double deepening justification is not a popular view in the RCC, though. Why is that? Double deepening. I'm trying to think of what you mean by that. Double deepening? Double/deepening justification. Double deepening. Oh, do you mean that we're justified in baptism, but that our justification increases with each good work, good faith that we have, and it keeps on increasing? Is that what you mean by deepening? Because if that's the case, then I'm just following RCC doctrine, because that's what the church is taught. Okay, especially at the Council of Trent. So it's not my position. The only thing I did, see, and it was easy for me, but when I wrote Not by Faith Alone, what was that, 23 years ago, it was easy for me because I had the answer already of what the truth was. And that was what the Catholic Church taught. See, because before you ever sit down and write a book like Not by Faith Alone, you're going to have to know where your authority is. And that authority, if it's anything that it claims to be, has already given the answer many times in history. And I'm at the tail end of the history. So I'm not going to give anything new. The only thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to explain the Catholic doctrine in a way where, in my particular life and circumstance and experience, I can explain it in such a way where a typical Protestant would say, that makes sense. Okay, you don't get that a lot in medieval theology because they didn't have Protestantism to deal with. They just had their Catholic theology, their scholastic theology, or whether it was, even Augustine's Neoplatonist theology. But But there wasn't a lot of give and take because the Protestants hadn't come along yet. Hey, I went to a Protestant seminary. I was a Protestant for what, 17 years. I know how you guys think, okay? There's not much out there that I don't already know about you. And then I can take my Catholic experience and I can weigh the two out and express it in ways that I don't think a lot of people have expressed it before. Okay, now I'll give you a perfect example, and I use this with Michael Horton. And as a matter of fact, I've given this exegesis of this passage, Romans 4, to Michael Horton, I think about 3 or 4 times, and he just ignores it. Because I know he knows that it just cuts him to the quick. But, and I don't want to say this about anybody, but admitting it, it's going to be very hard, man. He's built his whole life around, I mean, he's the president of Westminster Theological Seminary, you know, one of the most prestigious Protestant seminaries in the world, okay? And his whole life has been knocking down Catholic justification. All right, but here's the deal. In Romans 4, and that's their favorite passage, okay? Because it talks about the man who doesn't do works and is justified and all this stuff. And when it's talking about David, okay? And they've been using this for years, decades, centuries, okay? And the Catholics would look at it and go, boo, 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 you know, it does say no works. And it does say that he got his justification as a free gift and all this. So, you know, here I'm a Catholic and I'm teaching that, you know, we get justified by our works. And yet Paul seems to be saying just the opposite in Romans 4. How am I going to explain this to people? Okay, and the usual way would be to go to James 2:21 to 24 and say, well, James says, you know, man is justified by works and not by faith alone. Okay, yeah, that works. Okay, but it doesn't explain why Paul said it the way he did in Romans chapter 4. Okay, and if you're going to be as historically accurate and exegetically honest with Paul as you are with James 2:21 to 24, and you take those words at face value and take them literally, okay, well, you're going to have to do the same thing with Romans chapter 4. You just can't go into the analysis of these passages and say, well, yeah, I know what Paul says, and it looks like he's saying that, you know, we're saved without works, and it's a free gift from God. But, you know, James says this over here, so that counterbalances Paul. No. Okay, that's not the way we do biblical exegesis. Unfortunately, that's the way a lot of Catholics do it. Okay. And of course, you know, they'll back it up by saying, and even Martin Luther took out James chapter 2, or he took out the whole book of James because he didn't like the way James was disagreeing with Paul. Now, in the end, James doesn't disagree with Paul, but you got to be able to get to that solution the right way. You don't get to it by saying, well, James just sort of modifies Paul, and so we'll just let St. Paul, you know, say what he has to say, but we know he doesn't really mean that. Okay. Well, no, yes, he does mean that. Okay. He means that just as much as James means what James says in James chapter 2. Okay. And you have to find the proper bridge for those two seemingly diverse views of justification. And if you can't, then just shut up. Okay. Because we don't want to confuse anybody. All right. So here's what I proposed for, like, in Not by Faith Alone, which was, first of all, to sort of knock the foundations out from under them. I said, now David says here in Romans 4, verse 5, that, you know, blessed is the man who has his sins forgiven and does not do any works, but receives it as a free gift from God. And the verse prior says, you know, we're saved not by works, because it's not a matter of debt. It's a gift of God. Okay. So I was just looking at this one day, and it's amazing too, because it was at the worst time in my life, absolute worst time in my life, when I was writing Not by Faith Alone. So that book has a lot of blood, a lot of sweat, and a lot of tears in it. But at any rate, it just struck me. I said, well, who is Paul quoting? And he says, very easily, he says, as David says, blessed is the man whose sins are forgiven. All right, well, doesn't that seem obvious? That he's taking David's experience that he had with God concerning the sins that he committed. And what were those sins? Well, Paul was pointing back to Psalm 32 and Psalm 51, where David says, where we find out that David committed a sin, and this is in 2 Samuel 11 and 12. He committed adultery with Bathsheba, and he committed murder by having her husband murdered so that he couldn't tell the truth. Uriah. Okay. Now, what are these in Catholic theology? Adultery and murder? They're called mortal sins, and they will send you to hell. Okay. So from Catholic theology, then, we know that David was in mortal sin. And what happens when you commit mortal sin? Well, you lose your justification. And you can't get it back until you confess that sin or the sins, and formally now in the confessional to a priest who can give you absolution. Okay, but at that time, David did it through Nathan the prophet, so to speak, to God, because Nathan was the one who brought the knowledge of these sins to David, and David said, oh yeah, you caught me. And so he was as ungodly as any person on the face of the earth was ungodly at that time when he committed those sins. And, you know, fortunately, he was told about these sins, that God knows about them, and right away he repented of his sin. And God forgave him. Okay. Now, he did punish David temporarily, took away his son that was born from Bathsheba within 7 days, and all David's wives were raped. Okay. Yeah, God was pretty serious about sin. But David's eternal salvation was preserved or restored. And that's what David's talking about in Romans 4. Blessed is the man whose sins are forgiven. Okay. And he says, and no work was done. Well, did David do any work in the Old Testament to have this? No. Okay. He didn't go run to the priest and have sacrifices offered, because those sacrifices would just stink in the nose of God. If you think sacrifices are going to remedy the situation, you know nothing about me or salvation. It's the repentance that David gave to God. Okay, that is classed as not working. Okay, God didn't owe anything to David. As a matter of fact, if David worked, then God would owe him something, because that's what work requires, some kind of remuneration. So no works involved, he just repents. Okay, and Paul says he's justified. He gets his justification back. And then if you want to compare that to what happened to Abraham in Romans chapter 4, verses 1 to 4, Okay, Abraham believes and he's justified. So we know we're talking about a justification, a real justification. Okay, so if David receives a justification, but let's say it's his first justification, well, that would mean that all of David's life prior to the incident with Bathsheba and Uriah, he lived like a pagan because he wasn't justified. Is that the kind of picture that Psalms give us about David from Psalm 1 to Psalm 31? That he was some pagan heathen that didn't know God? Not quite. We have some of the most beautiful poetry ever written by a man who's in love with his God in Psalms 1 through 31. Okay, so obviously this man was justified. He knew God. As a matter of fact, God brags about David. And in the historical books, it says, there has hardly been a man like David. The only fault he had was this adultery and murder. That's pretty good, considering he committed adultery and murder. That, I haven't met a man like David, God says. All right. So obviously this man was justified. So what happened when he committed adultery and murder? Well, he had to lose that justification because he says in verse 5 and 6 of Romans 4 that he became an ungodly man. Well, how do you become ungodly? You don't become ungodly if you're justified. You can only become ungodly if you've lost your justification. And you're on your way to hell for your mortal sins. Okay? So now he gets his justification back because he repented, just like the Catholic Church says about confession. When we commit mortal sin, whether adultery, murder, whatever, we lose our justification. We're on our way to hell, as the church has always taught. And then we go to the confessional, we confess, we get absolution, we get our justification restored. Okay, so if there's any passage that talks about Catholic theology and how we're justified, it's Romans chapter 4, the very passage that Protestants pride themselves on as the teaching that we're saved by faith without works. Okay? So let's look at this works thing. Well, first of all, let me tell you, I even had that passage exegeted for Michael Horton right on his radio program several years ago. And he had me write a piece on it that he included in his book, Various Views of Justification. I forget what the exact title was. And I wrote the piece for him. He published it, along with, a dozen other people who had ideas of justification. But he never answered the proposition that I'm bringing here tonight. How is it that you can say that as a Protestant, David was justified in Romans 4, and yet he had to be justified before he committed the sins of murder and adultery? Aren't there two justifications here? Well, yes, there is. But if a Protestant admits that, then he's not a Protestant anymore. He's Catholic. You see, the Protestants can only have one justification, especially in the Reformed faith of Calvin and Luther, because once they have that justification, they can never lose it because they're the elect now. Okay? So Romans 4, if they interpret it by saying, well, David had his justification in the beginning when he was the man of God, and then he committed adultery and murder and lost his justification and became ungodly, that just blows the whole Reformation to smithereens. You see? Now let's take a look at the works thing. This is easily handled, easily, but they have an escape clause. These Protestants. What Paul in Romans 4:4 says, we're justified by faith without works. And then in Romans 3:28, the famous verse that Luther used, you know, a man is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Okay. And, you know, in the margin of his German Bible, he wrote the word alone with faith. So you would read it in Luther's German Bible, you know, a man is justified by faith alone apart from works of the law. Little historical tidbit I want to throw in there. Nevertheless, so the whole thing has been, well, you know, you Catholics, you know, you have all these works. But right here in Romans 3:28 and Romans 4:4, it says, without works. Okay? Well, here's the way you understand that. It's very easy. In Romans 4:4, he says, if it's by works, then it's by a system of debt. Okay? So you notice how he qualifies that. These works that he are talking about is just as if I tried to put God in debt. And I said to God, you know what? I really don't care about you that much. I don't like the way you created this world. But I'm going to do this work here. And if I do work, then you owe me. You have to pay me because I'm doing work. So I'm going to obligate you by contract to pay me for my services rendered. Okay? That's what Paul's talking about there. Why? Because he uses the word debt, ophelamos, in the Greek. So, who was trying to do this? Well, the Jews were trying to do it. That's why Paul talks about the Jews through chapters 1, 2, and 3 before he gets to 4. And how are they doing that? Well, circumcision was one way. Just because I'm Jewish is another way. I do all these sacrifices as Moses said. I do circumcision as Abraham gave us. So all these things basically are my works. And more like the Pharisee, I fast twice a week, or I do all these things. So basically, God, you are obligated to pay me for those works. Okay? There you go. And the Gentiles, they don't have any of these traditional rituals that we grew up with as Jews. They're the heathen, you see. And since they don't have that of all these things available for them to do as their works, well, they're not in the same situation as we are. We're the children of Abraham. We are the privileged people. We do these works, and you owe us. And what's Paul's answer to that? No. Okay? You try to put God into a position of being obligated to pay you for your work, God's going to curse you more than he curses other people. Because you cannot put God in that situation. He sums it up very well, which is Romans 11:36, where Paul says, God is obligated to no man. He owes no man anything. Okay? And so you can never come to God and say, I really don't care about you, your plan, whatever. But I don't want to go to hell, so I'm going to do these works, and that way I can be saved and not have to go through any of that, punishment and all that stuff. You think God's going to accept that kind of relationship? No way. Okay? What the relationship God wants is the one where you love him for who he is, for what he's created, for his vision for the whole universe. Everything he has done, is doing, and will do. You love it, you appreciate it, your whole life is involved with it, and you love God for who he is. You believe in him, even though you can't see him. You know this world can't come into existence by itself. So you believe in him. And then you see what he's trying to do with this world that he's created, and you love him for it, because he's going to give you more than you'll ever imagine possible. Okay? And not only that, is he's a personal being who wants a personal relationship with you. Okay? It's not some, force out there, or some deist conception of God where he created everything and then left us on our own. No, this is a personal being. He is so personal that with Moses, for example, he says he talked to Moses face to face as a man talks to his friend. We went through this last week where Moses had this relationship with God where he could talk to him and say, God, please don't destroy the Israelites. And God changes his mind because of Moses' pleading. And then in the next chapter, God says, I'm not going to go through the desert with you, because if the Israelites sin again against me, I may destroy them. And Moses pleads with them, please come, because if you don't, we might be destroyed by other things. And God says, all right, I'll come with you. That's the kind of God. This is the kind of relationship God wants. When he talks about having faith in him and loving him, that's what he's talking about. Okay? That's what pleases God. That's what he wants. Whenever he talks about faith in the New Testament, this is what he wants. Not just, okay, I believe. No, I want a deep, deep relationship with you. And in turn, I will give you everything you couldn't even imagine what you're going to have. It's going to be so grand. I often compare this teaching to, like, let's say you worked for IBM. You're an employee, you work your 40 hours a week. You never met the CEO. You're a technician, and you punch your time card, and you get paid for your work for that 40 hours. You go home, come back the next day, same thing over and over again. That's an employer-employee relationship, and that is a contractual relationship. And it's based on debt, because if you work for a corporate entity, then they are required by law to pay you for your work. And you can care less about them, have no relationship with them personally whatsoever, but as long as you come in and do your work, they are required to pay you. And they don't have any kind of personal relationship with you either. Okay? They see your time card, they see your name, they don't even know who's behind the name. All they know is we got a time card here with 40 hours on it, we have to pay it. Comptroller pays you. That's it. That's called a debt-based relationship. Okay? So here's another kind of relationship. This is a personal relationship. This is the one that God wants. And so let's say after punching your time card for 20 years and paying you, the boss calls you up on the phone. He sees what a good job you've done, and says, I and my family are moving on the other side of town, and I'm getting employees together from work and having them come over to meet my family. And, could you help us move some of our furniture into the truck? And and then and after that, we may go swimming in my swimming pool, and we'll have a big dinner together, and we'll get to know each other. After all this time, you've been working here for 20 years, we'll get to know each other on a personal basis. Okay, so you're saying this invitation, you go, and you work like crazy, moving the furniture, and you meet the boss for the first time, and his wife and his kids. And at the end of the day, you're sweating, you're tired, you want to go home. He goes, hey, let's go refresh in my swimming pool. We'll have a few beers together, converse, all this thing. So you do that and you get to know him really well. And now, does he owe you for that at all? Does he owe you any money because you came over at his invitation to move his furniture and all that? Excuse me. No, he doesn't owe you a cent. You came over of your own free will, an invitation. You never said, I'm going to pay you. The only pay would be the the meal and the swimming pool, but that's not pay. You're not on a time clock. Okay. You just went over there of your own free will, and whatever happens, happens, so to speak. All right. So this is a very personal relationship. He doesn't owe you a cent. All right. And it may come out in the future where he says, gosh, I really like John. He's been working here for 20 years. I invited him over. We had a great conversation. He worked really hard and moving my furniture for me. And, well, this is the kind of guy that I would want to put into this position of CFO, because you were so diligent. You thought, it was not a big deal, but to the boss, it was a big deal because he wanted to know what kind of man he's dealing with. And you did such a good job. He was going to put you on a list for CEO or even CFO and make you one. Okay. So what did all this gain for you? Much more than you ever imagined, you see, because you had a personal relationship with him. Now he's going to elevate you to one of the highest positions in the company. Or maybe something comparable, CFO. I don't know how these businesses run, but he's going to elevate you because he got to know you. He sees you're an honest man, hard worker, blah, blah, blah. This is the kind of man he wants in the upper echelons of his business. Okay? And this is exactly how our relationship with God works. If you come up to God and say, hey, here's my time card. I worked 8 hours moving your furniture. You owe me this much. Can you imagine what would have happened to John if he did that to his boss when he came over to move his furniture? Well, that's what the Jews were doing to God. They didn't care about God. They just did their work and say, here's what you owe me. Pay me. All right. And Paul says, no. That's never been the case, never will be the case. Okay. So when God says have faith and work, he's not talking about work of debt where you bring your time card in and say you owe me. He's talking about faith and work out of love for him and his whole vision for the universe. Just like John went over to move the furniture of his boss. He went over there without any sense of God owing him anything, or of his boss owing him anything. Same thing we do with God. We give him our faith, our works, our hope, and we come back to him, as Luke 10:17 says, and we just say, we don't deserve anything. We are just doing our job. We're just doing what's required of us. And for that attitude, God's going to give him eternal life in total bliss and joy. If he sees that attitude in them, you see. So it's not, when Paul says, not of works, he's talking about works of debt, where we try to put God into some obligatory contractual relationship where it doesn't matter what we think of him, he just owes us for our work. That's anathema. Okay? But not work where we do it because we love God and are working on his side and want to see everything accomplished that he wants accomplished. You see, that work is not work of debt. All right? So it all depends on what context we're talking about here. And so when we go to James, James's work is what? He does what God required of him, but there's no payment that God's going to owe him for that. God wants to see what kind of man he is. You know, if I'm going to rest the whole salvation of the world upon you, I want to make sure I got the right guy. Okay. So he puts them through these tests. Abraham passes them all. Okay. And how is Abraham compensated, so to speak? Because of God's promise. Not because God said, well, yeah, if you do this, I owe you something, because God owes no man anything. But God, as the benefactor, can make a promise to say, you know, if you do this, here is what I will give in return, without being on a contractual basis. Okay? Because in a benefactor, benefactee relationship, it's all personal. They're all doing it because they love one another. They have faith in one another. You see, it's all personal. And it's given by God's promise. What's the basis of that? Not a contract. The basis is the character of God. The character of God, that when he makes a promise, he will fulfill it. That's also called a covenant. What makes a covenant a covenant? The character of the person who made it. Because that's the only person that's going to fulfill a covenant. You see. And so in that kind of relationship, yeah, it's all built on God's promise, not because God owes anybody anything. Okay. So at any rate, went a little far behind on that one, but you know, this is the kind of stuff that I wrote about, not by faith alone. Okay. Explained to a Protestant in a way that I am sure he's never been confronted with, you know. And I remember also in that section, I talk about Romans 2, where Paul is saying that God will judge each one according to his works. Romans 2 at verse 8. God will judge each person according to his works. And for those who have done good, there will be glory. For those who have done bad, there will be tribulation and fury. Okay. So the Protestants look at this, Romans 2, and they say, well, if they're going to be judged by their works, but Paul says over here in Romans 3:28 and Romans 4:4 that they're not judged by their works, how do we combine those two? Well, here's what they do. They make Romans 2 hypothetical, meaning that they will say, okay, Paul says we're going to be judged by our works and rewarded based on our works. They say, that's the way it would work if it could work that way. But Paul's saying that it can't work that way. Why? Well, because when he comes over to Romans 3:28 and Romans 4:4, he says that we can't be saved by works. So they take what seems to be a contradiction and deal with it by saying that Paul's first passage, Romans 2, is hypothetical. The real history, the real theological teaching is Romans 3 and 4. So basically what you've done is you've dichotomized the Bible, okay? And Paul makes no indication that what he's saying in Romans 2 is hypothetical. They just throw that in there. Why? Because they have no other choice, okay? But if you understand works as works done on the basis of grace, wherein I do it now not to have God pay me as if I had a contract with him, but I do my works because I'm prompted by God to do them, and I do them because I love God and want to work for his universe. Okay? If you understand works in that way, then the works of Romans 2 do not contradict the works of Romans 3 and 4. Okay? And if you read Romans 2, you see God's grace flowing all the way through it. So the whole thing is based on grace. And that's why we as Catholics do our works. We're not doing works of debt, we're doing works of grace that don't seek an obligatory payment from God. They seek a reward from God who promised that he would reward. Okay? A God who's not obligated to pay anybody. So that's how we deal with it. Okay? And again, if you want to find out more about that and not by faith alone, it's there at robertsongenis.com. And we just put a second edition out, as a matter of fact. All right, let me see what else we got here. What is your thought on Michael Heiser? I think if he's right about the Watchers and the Nephilim and such, it actually sort of vindicates Catholicism in multiple ways. Well, I never have gotten into his theory about the Watchers. And I would like to know why you think it vindicates Catholicism. So if you could write back and give that to me, I'd like to follow that. What I do know of Michael Heiser is not something I like very much. And that is because he takes the liberal hermeneutic many times when he's dealing with Genesis and the genealogies. And, the liberals believe that, Moses did not write Genesis, that, it's a product of the Mesopotamian culture of 3000 BC. And the Mesopotamians created creation stories, flood stories, Tower of Babel stories, genealogies, and the Hebrews came along a few hundred years later, and not actually 100 years, a few hundred years later, they came along in the Babylonian captivity, which would be 2,500 years later. And because they were in Babylon, they became familiar with all these Mesopotamian literature about floods and creation and Babel and all this stuff. And they made up their own stories from the Mesopotamian culture instead of them being inspired by God. And this is where I have a little problem with Heiser. I don't even know whether he really believes that Genesis was inspired by God. And he may say he does, but if you believe that this was a product of some Babylonian culture, the Genesis stories, that I just, right from the get-go. And I ran into him because I had to deal with the flat earthers when I wrote my book. And I listened to a couple of lectures of Heiser, and I just didn't like where he ended up in his exegesis because I could tell it was liberal influenced. Okay. So that's as far as I got with him. But if there's something else you want me to look at about the Watchers of Nephilim, I know people try to make a big thing about the Nephilim. I don't. Okay. I just, because I know the etymology of the word, and I don't see anything in there that is of such fascination as some people try to make of it. Okay. And you can find this all in my Genesis commentary. I go through the word Nephilim and I show where it's derived from and what it means in the cultural context. And, so I've done some work on that. All right. So let me go on to the next one. Got 3 questions I hope can be answered briefly. Briefly, I can't promise you that. So in asserting that Christ died at 33 AD, this means he was 32 when he died. Some spiritual writers, John Eudes, places the age at 33. And there in 3 months. Thus, 34 AD is the date they prefer. which of the two is more supported by the evidence? The Challoner Bible is quite different in many ways from the DR Bible of 1582 and 1610. Given this, which of, where are we? Okay, given this, which of the two would you consider as more accurate translation? Christ spoke Aramaic, but I was wondering when he and others addressed his mother and Joseph, did he use Aramaic or Hebrew names? All right. Yeah, we say 33 AD. There's another possibility of 30 AD, but not really close as 33 AD when you add all the numbers up. The way you would get to this is you would say, first of all, Jesus was born on December 25th, 1 BC. Okay. And then you can track his life and show that 33 AD is the time he died and how old he was. Okay. So this entails accepting December 25th, 1 BC as the birth of Christ. Now that was 8 days from January 1st. And so that's why the church has never said 1 BC, because first of all, there's no year zero. It goes from 1 BC to 1 AD. There's no year zero. Okay. So it's just 8 days. The 1 BC, December 25th, is just 8 days from January 1st. So we usually say 1 AD. Christ was born in 1 AD with that proviso. Okay. And in my Genesis commentary, I have a section that shows you how we get to December 25th. That is the real date. Okay. Now, it has nothing to do with Saturnalia and all this other stuff. Okay. That traditional date is confirmed by Dionysius and so on as we go through the Middle Ages. And so that's where you would start. And if you start there, then you end up at 33 years old at 33 AD. Okay. Now, what is it? We have a little leeway there because in Matthew's gospel it says Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. Okay. So we have a little leeway to play there with, and we would say that he was baptized in the fall of 29 AD, and we can fit that in with everything, and then in the spring of 33 AD, he was crucified. Okay? The Challoner Bible is quite different in many ways from the DR Bible. Well, they had the Old English, okay? That the DR Bible, especially the 1899 version, Douay Rheims Bible, cleaned up a lot of that Old English. Okay. And you just have to figure any translation is going to have to go through revisions. Okay. And the revisions are revised for a reason, because there's either mistakes in the previous Bibles, or the grammar is obtuse, or the words have different spellings, things of that nature. Okay. So you never make a Bible translation thinking this is it. Even the Latin Vulgate, we've had 5 editions of the Latin Vulgate. Okay. The Wordsworth edition, the Clementine edition, so on and so on. All right. They correct mistakes. Okay. So anybody who thinks that the Latin Vulgate's infallible is fallible, because it just didn't turn out that way. Okay. So the same thing with the English translations. It's very rare that you get a translation that's not revised at some point in time. And if it isn't revised, then it's not because it's a perfect translation. I guarantee you that. So, the only way you're going to know who's closer, you got to know the original languages. You got to know Hebrew and you have to know Greek, because those are the languages God inspired. He did not inspire the Latin Vulgate, and he did not inspire any English translations that come from the Latin Vulgate. Okay? Any scholar worth his salt is going to depend on the original languages of the inspired Bible. And unfortunately, a lot of our Catholic seminarians aren't taught a lot of Hebrew and Greek. And so they're at a loss if you're just depending on the Latin Vulgate. And the grammatical nuances in the Greek are far, far away much more acute in the Greek than they are in Latin. Okay. So, we need to do a lot of work as Catholics to brush up on that. And so, if I were running the seminaries, I would make mandatory, 4 years Hebrew, 4 years Greek, and, and along with the Latin, because these things will be invaluable to a priest, bishop, college professor, that nothing can replace. Okay. So now 3, Christ spoke Aramaic, but I was wondering, when he and others addressed his mother and Joseph, did he use Aramaic or Hebrew? We don't know. We don't even know if he spoke in Aramaic. We assume he did. Okay. There are some scholars who think Jesus spoke in Greek. Now he would know Hebrew. He grew up as a Jew. Aramaic was a different form of Hebrew. But whether he spoke Aramaic, we don't know. We really don't know. Okay, we just base that on certain things that Jesus says in the Gospels, like, when he raised the girl from the dead, he said something in Aramaic. Tabitha cum, I think it was. And other times Jesus said certain Aramaic words. So yeah, we don't know for sure. Okay, so I'll have to leave it at there. JB Cool says, do you still debate? And have you heard of J. Dyer, an Eastern Orthodox apologist? I can't find any debates with you against an Eastern Orthodox. What is your view of Eastern Orthodoxy? Yeah, I appreciate their faith in God, but theologically, doctrinally, they're wrong. That's how I view the Eastern Orthodox. Okay? If the church says that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son, then that's the truth. Okay? And there can't be two truths. They either proceeded from the Father alone or from the Father and the Son. The Catholic Roman faith says from the Father and the Son. So they're wrong. They're in heresy about that. Okay? They have different views of the Immaculate Conception, purgatory, indulgences, all that stuff. They're wrong there too. Okay? Because there's only one truth. There can't be two. Okay? So they're wrong. And I think a lot of this is political because they're from the East. The East and the West have always had problems keeping things together. So, an outfit like this, and by the way, I did make a mistake last week. I said 250,000. I probably meant to say 250 million. There are 250 million Eastern Orthodox. I don't know where I got the 250. Maybe I was tired that night, but that is certainly wrong. But God will judge them. God's going to be fair when he judges them. And because he will not judge anybody who does not deserve to be judged and punished for it. Okay. And that's where I leave it. My debating career basically is centered around Protestants because that's where I found most of the controversy. I found I didn't find as many open avenues for debating the Eastern Orthodox, so I never really dealt with that. And so there are no debates with me against an Eastern Orthodox. And my debating days, except for a few exceptions, have basically over. You know, I've asked many people, at least in the science issues, to debate. Can't find anybody that will debate. I'm talking about a public debate, audience participated, monitored debate. Can't find anybody who wants to do that. As far as debating Protestants now, I'm open to it. If somebody wants to pay the freight, this is what happens with these things. They're so expensive to get together. Plane flights, audience, facilities, all that stuff. It just takes so much time and effort and work. Fortunately, I had somebody doing all that for me when I was debating before, but the internet's changed a lot of things. It just makes it too simple to engage in formal debates. But I'm sure there's always room for debate. But to me, this is the greatest communication that I can have with my audiences. I'm just so happy that this has been given to me to do, having these sessions, 2-hour sessions where I can answer questions, and then they put on podcasts and they can listen to them whenever they can and want to. It's just really great. So I'm open to debate, but my debating days, I don't think are as productive or as forecasted to be forecasted to be done in the future. I don't think that will happen. What is the name of God, Yahweh or Jehovah? There are Catholic apologists saying it cannot be Jehovah. There's no letter J in Hebrew. Yeah, but they don't use Jehovah for the J sound. They use it for the Hey sound. Yehovah would be the way you would say it in Hebrew. Yahweh, well, let's just say this. Both words are trying to figure out how to pronounce the Hebrew tetragrammaton. It's 4 letters in Hebrew, okay? The first is a yod, and that's pronounced usually Yah, okay? Then you have a vav, and that's usually pronounced like a V sound, okay? And then you have a Hey, Hebrew letter Hey, which is pronounced Ha. And then you have what's the last letter? I can't remember what the last letter is. Anyway, so it looks like it's pronounced Yahweh, Yahweh, Yah. You get the yod sound, the vav sound, Yahweh. Okay. But the problem with the tetragrammaton is it doesn't have any vowels. Okay. All of Hebrew is written without vowels. Every word is a combination of consonants. Okay. And each word actually it has a root of 3 Hebrew consonants, and then you can add prefixes and suffixes to it. Okay, so it's very simple language, but has no vowels, and the only way that a Hebrew person would know how to pronounce these consonants is by the tradition. So the tradition was passed down to them, and it said, you pronounced, Yo, Vav, Hey, whatever, as Yahweh or Yehovah, depending on what vowels you would put in there. Okay. Now, Hebrew we have today that was transcribed by the Masoretes in the 900s AD, they put what they call vowel points, or vowel markings, let's say, on the Hebrew consonants, and of what they thought was the proper way to pronounce a Hebrew word. Now, it's not like they just did this out of a vacuum, okay? They have a whole tradition behind them, rabbis and so on from century to century to century, giving them how these consonants are supposed to be pronounced, okay? And so they have a pretty good idea of how they're to be pronounced, and so they have various vowel points on these consonants. But the original Tetragrammaton had no vowel points on it. And depending on the vowels that you mark it with, it's going to determine how you say the word. One way is Yahweh. Another way is Yahweh. Another way is Yahovah. Okay, Yahovah. And how do you get that hey sound out of the beginning? You use a J. In English, like in Spanish, the J can be a ha instead of a J sound, like we use in English. Okay. And that's the way the J is used in a lot of languages, the ha sound. So that's where they go, Yahovah. Okay. So basically, Yahweh, Jehovah are just two different ways of saying a word that we don't know how to pronounce in English. If that helps you. Okay. All right. Do you think that only Catholics will be saved? I don't know. I'm not in charge of salvation. God's in charge of salvation. And God will judge everyone with the fairest, absolute judgment that can be judged on someone. Okay. Now, I know what the church teaches as far as the ordinary rule of salvation. Okay. Anybody who refuses to submit to the pontiff, schismatics, Jews, whatever they are, as Eugene IV said, or Boniface VIII said, that's Catholic dogma. I can't change that. Okay. And that is true. Outside the church, there is no salvation. But then when that was analyzed by popes prior, like Pius IX, there come a point where you say, yes, this is the general rule. The Catholic Church has always lived by this. Okay. But then there are those who are in invincible ignorance. That is, there's no way we can get the gospel to them. And they live in this ignorance, yet they know God exists and they obey God, and God's going to be their judge. Okay. That's where the church has left it. Okay. And on this side of the grave, we would expect that very thing to happen. And the church has handled it in the way she's handled it. And that's all there is to it. Okay. Because I always say there can only be one church. You can't have two churches. Okay. And if it's the one church, then that's where you have to go to be saved. Okay. That only makes sense, logical sense. All right. Are you aware of astrophysicist Guillermo Gonzalez's work? Yes. He believes in intelligent design cost him his career. Believes evidence points to a heliocentric system. Well, this is a problem with Guillermo and his co-author. They see all this they see all the signs in the universe for a centralized Earth, but they ignore them. They don't follow them to their logical conclusion. Like the cosmic microwave background radiation. They see the axis of evil. They see the galaxy formations in concentric spheres around the Earth. They see a lot of the same things we saw when we made our movie, The Principle, and yet they don't take it to the next step. And this is a problem with a lot of Protestant scientists, the ones who work for CRI or whoever they're working for. They take Genesis 5 verses 20 to 31 very literally in combating evolution. But when it comes time to interpreting literally Genesis 1 verses 1 to 19, oh boy, we got all kinds of ways to get around the literal interpretation, so the Protestants claim or do. So they speak out of both sides of their mouth, as far as I'm concerned, and so does Guillermo. And to me that's just a contradiction. Okay, look, either the Bible's written literally, face value, or it's not. And if it is, then be consistent in your interpretation. And what does Genesis 1 tell us? It says the earth was formed first, and then the sun, stars, and the moon. Okay? So if you can't accept that, then don't bother giving me other interpretations of either Genesis or any other passage. Okay? Because if you're not going to be consistent with the first page of the Bible, what am I going to expect that you're going to do when you meet up with some difficulty? Okay? So, he believes in intelligent design because he takes Genesis 1 verses 20 to 31 at face value, literally. Okay? But he's a heliocentrist because he doesn't take Genesis 1 verses 1 to 20, or verse 1 to 19, literally. And this is the problem I've had with them from the beginning. So, of course, to admit that we live in a geocentric universe means that the church was right when she condemned Galileo. And of course, if she was right when she condemned Galileo, then she was right about the Protestant Reformation, that it was not of God. Okay? A lot of Protestants don't want to go there because they know if they admit one, they have to admit the other. All right? But this is the glory of the Catholic Church, because we can say she's always been led by the Holy Spirit to what the truth is about whatever she claims is important to know the truth of. And apparently the cosmos and what revolved around what was important enough for the church to address, and she did. And she gave us the answer. But Galileo and Copernicus were wrong. Okay? So you either accept that or you don't. Okay? So there we have it. All right. It's 10 after 10. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question. Okay. All right. Former Protestant, now Catholic, believes the Antichrist will be the Islamic savior described in the Quran. Do you know about this or have any opinion on this theory? Yeah, I don't think it's going to be somebody from Islam. It's going to be somebody from the Catholic Church. He's going to sit in the temple and call himself God. So it's going to be somebody, and he's called the son of perdition. And this gives us the indication that as Judas was part of the apostolic band and he betrayed Jesus, okay, this Antichrist is going to come from the inner circles of the church and betray the faith and form this religion that he's going to form. Okay, that's where it's going to come from, not from Islam. Teresa Beam on HFM asks, the Catechism teaches the Sabbath commandment is part of the eternal law, while Aquinas says it's ceremonial. Can you comment? Yes. The difference is the Catechism is saying that we are the honor of God on a specific day is an eternal law. That's true. Okay. And so the eternal law started first. Then you have the Mosaic law. Okay. And the day that the Mosaic law picks to obey that eternal law, okay, is Saturday. Okay. There are reasons for that, but that's the day they pick. Okay. Now you come to the New Testament, the New Covenant, which abrogates the Old Covenant, the Mosaic Covenant. So the whole thing, all of the Mosaic Covenant, whether it's the Sabbath or the first commandment, the second commandment, third commandment, and all that those commandments entailed of how you obey them in the civil and ceremonial society of Israel, all of it, that is abrogated. Okay. So the new covenant then looks to the eternal law, okay, and abides by the eternal law. So therefore, the new covenant will say the same thing the Mosaic covenant did in some respects. It'll say, worship God alone, have no other strange gods before me, honor God by worship, do not steal, do not commit adultery, all these things, because they were all eternal laws. Okay. What's happened though is you have two different systems now taking from the eternal law what laws are going to be practiced and how they're going to be practiced in two diverse covenants. Okay, in the Mosaic covenant, they're practiced a certain way. In the new covenant, they're going to be practiced a different way. One of those differences is the day of the week that's chosen. And so the new covenant chooses the first day of the week, while the old covenant chose the seventh day, the last day of the week. Okay. And that's why, for example, when Paul is reiterating the commandments in Romans 13, he doesn't mention the Sabbath day. He skips right over it. Okay. And then he lists all the commandments that they are to obey. Why? Well, one of the major reasons why is because the Mosaic covenant worshiped God in a particular way. They had these blood sacrifices, they had circumcision, they had various civil laws that were very meticulous. And so the new covenant basically abrogates all of that, because all of those particular ways are fulfilled by Christ when he comes. And so these have no use anymore. Okay. They were only shadows looking toward the figure. And so they're done away with. But since there's an eternal aspect to those commandments, the new covenant takes from the eternal aspect and then formulates it in the way the new covenant does in the New Testament. Okay. We now worship on the first day of the week because we're following different parameters now. Christ rose on the first day of the week, so that's why we choose that day. Okay. We have priests now that give absolution for mortal sin. We have the Eucharist that replaces the bread and the Passover and all those kinds of things they had in the Old Testament, and so on and so on. Okay. But you have to understand that once the new covenant supersedes and abrogates that Mosaic covenant, then nothing of the Mosaic covenant exists anymore. We can read about it in the Old Testament and see how they lived, but we're under no obligation to obey them whatsoever, because you can't have two competing covenants. Okay, once one replaces, that means this one's in charge, and this one now makes the rules. But where are they going to get the rules from? Well, they're going to get it from that eternal law that was up there. Some of it was reiterated in the Mosaic law, so they can look at that to see what the eternal correspondent was for the new covenant, you see. So that's how it would work. So when Aquinas says it's ceremonial, he's correct. When the church says it's eternal, she's correct, because you're dealing with two different aspects. Aquinas is dealing with the replacement of the Mosaic covenant by the new covenant. The Catechism is dealing with the new covenant, drawing its laws from the eternal law of God. Okay? How do we defend papism against the claims of Eastern Orthodox? Well, we were talking about this before. Look, from the beginning, and I was just looking at Jafari's translation of Denzinger today, and all the times that the councils say, Jesus said, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. That verse is probably repeated about, at least 24 times that I looked up. And this was just tonight. I just happened to come across it tonight. From the early councils all the way through Council of Trent and beyond, this is the verse that the church has used. Okay? And it's only talking about Peter. He is the one that's given the keys of the kingdom. No other apostles given the keys of the kingdom. And with those keys, Jesus says, whatever you bind is bound, whatever you loose is loosed. You know, it's as clear as day. There should be no problem with this passage, especially as the councils repeated it over and over again to prove to everyone that the Catholic Church was the only church, only Christ church on earth. No other church has any authority, jurisdiction, anything. This was it. You know, if we can't follow that simple passage, you know, I don't give much hope for anybody else. But that passage is clear as day. Okay? Monk Seraphim, how are you doing? All the way from Finland, is that correct? Oh, I haven't seen you in, gosh, since what, 2007? I hope things are going well. I think you're the same person. Anyway, you say, Dear Robert, thank you for your work. Please give with some words Wallace's experiment principles in the light of geocentrism. Well, he just was basically trying to figure out if he could find the difference between mass inertia and gravitational inertia. And he claimed that there was no difference. And this made Einstein famous. It doesn't really have, well, it does, I guess it does relate to geocentrism in the sense that the basis for Einstein's general relativity is equivalence or covariance. In other words, for Einstein, and he found this out by a rude awakening in 1915, when having to deal with all of Ernst Mach's works about the general principle of relativity, and Poincaré's work also, he came to the conclusion that there is no difference between a fixed Earth and the universe going around it on a daily basis, or the Earth rotating in a fixed universe. That's called the principle of dynamic equivalence. Okay? That's based on, you could say, the proof that Etwas gave to Einstein about there being no difference between mass inertia and gravitational inertia, because that's what makes up the equivalence. Okay? So, yeah, in a roundabout way, you could say that it does deal with geocentrism. Okay? All right. Is there a expiatory quality at all to Christ's sacrifice? It seems you only stress the propitiatory sacrifice. That's because there is no expiatory quality. Okay? And you can't divide this up. You can't say, well, half of it's expiatory and half of it's propitiatory. It ain't going to work that way. Okay? It's either all expiatory or all propitiatory. Okay? Either there was a legal price that Christ paid for the sins of the world. Now, when we say legal price, we're talking about, you go buy a bag of oranges and it's $1.39. Okay. And $1.38 is not going to pay for it. You have to have $1.39. Unless, of course, the grocer has mercy on you, but that has nothing to do with legalness. That's mercy outside of the law. Okay? The law says, here's the price, $1.39. You have to pay that price to get this bag of oranges. That's what expiatory means. Okay? So either the cross was that kind of thing, or it was not. You can't have halfway. You can't say, well, it's, 70 cents, and then, ask me please, and I may give you the rest. Can't be. Okay? It's either legal or not legal. All right? And if it's not legal, then it's propitiatory. And what's the opposite of legal? Personal. Because in personal, there's no rules, basically, as to what's required. You just say, well, because of my, God says, let's say, because of my greatness, my glory, my honor, the only price, if you want to use price, that can be paid, if you want to use the word paid, is the death of my son. Okay. But that's not the way the New Testament looks at it. In the sense, it doesn't say it's a legal requirement that God's giving. Okay. It just says Christ voluntarily gave himself up in death to appease the Father's wrath, because the death of Christ was the only thing that was going to appease God, not the legal price that was paid to God. Okay. Because there's nothing legal about salvation at all. The only legalness we have is after the effect, so to speak. Let's say, like in baptism, now you're legally bound to the church. Okay, you receive the water, you receive the forgiveness of sins, and now you're legally bound to the church, or canonically bound, and you have to obey all those rules. But that's after, you see. We're talking about the atonement itself. What was the basis for it? Now, the Protestants, you're not going to find, you might find expiation in some liberal Catholic Bibles. You're not going to find it in the traditional Bibles at all. And you won't find it in the King James Bible either, because it's copied from the Douay Rheims Bible. You'll see the word propitiation for the Greek word hilasmos. You'll never see expiation. But why do some Protestant Bibles, well, actually most of them, use expiation? There's a couple that use propitiation, as a matter of fact, because they know the meaning of the Greek word. But most of them use expiation. Why? Because they think that that Christ paid a legal price for our sins on the cross. That's what they believe, that he gave a substitutionary atonement. He was the penal substitute, that instead of us going to the cross, Christ went to the cross. That has nothing to do with salvation. Okay? Christ is our propitiation to the Father to appease him of his wrath. That's it. Nothing legal about it. And that makes sense with everything else we read. Like, for example, 1 John chapter 2, verse 1 says, Christ is our propitiation and the propitiation of the whole world. Well, if Christ was our expiation and the expiation of the whole world, then the whole world should be saved. Because if the legal price was paid for the sins of the world, then there cannot be a double jeopardy. Once those sins are paid for, that's it. It's over. Okay? But that's not what happens, is it? No. Christ propitiates the Father so that the Father will make it possible for the world to be saved. So that's why the propitiation is not only for us Christians, but for the rest of the world, because God made it possible now for them to be saved. Will they be saved? Some of them. Okay? But if they were expiated, then all of them should be saved. If they're propitiated, then it only means the door is open for them to be saved. Okay, now they need to come through with faith and repentance and all the other things that are required. Okay, so there's the difference for you. That's why Catholic propitiation is the way to look at it. Oh, okay. I'm going to have to go because it's 10:30 now. 2.5 hours. I got to save some energy for tomorrow. So come back with your questions that I didn't answer tonight. As a matter of fact, I'm going to copy them down. And then I will look them over tomorrow before the program, and I will answer any of them that I think deserve an answer. Well, you all deserve an answer. I mean, what am I saying? Considering the time factor, I'm going to have to, I don't know if I can answer every one of them. The last time I tried to do this, I think I answered about 75% of them, and then the other 25% got lost. So that's what I mean. So I try to answer every one of your questions as best as I possibly can, and I'll definitely put that effort into these. So again, we'll come back tomorrow at 8 p.m. to who knows when. And we'll see you then. God bless you till then. Take care and love your Lord. Amen.